So, Steve and I had the luxury of speaking together in January of this year, and we really hadn't spent any time together, but I realized very quickly how brilliant he is, not just from a physician's perspective, but from a technology perspective. There's probably a whole list of accomplishments and credentials that Steve has, none of which I'm aware of. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Steven Steinhubl.
Get him a Christmas card. Thanks.
Thanks.
All right, so I am at Scripps Translational Science Institute, and you know, Clark sent me his slides, and I deeply regretted now not looking at them, because I really could have, you know, really meshed better with them if I had done that before I looked. But let me just, because I think we're a unique entity, and we fit. We're a part of Scripps Health, but we kind of really sit outside of Scripps Health. And I'll give you an example. So I came to Scripps STSI about 2.5 years ago. Before that, I was at Geisinger. But really, for the 15 years of my clinical career, I always balanced a little clinical research and clinical care. And all of that clinical research, 100% of it was within healthcare systems, typically in multi-center trials, working with multiple healthcare systems. So thanks to a grant from Qualcomm, we started a digital medicine group at STSI. Our focus is we don't develop technologies. Our goal is to develop the evidence base that shows how technologies can transform care. And as far as we know, we're the only research organization in the country or in the world that has that singular focus to show how these technologies can really make a difference. We're doing about 15 trials right now in different stages, roughly. 2 of those are done within Scripps. Both of those are just pilot studies to see if a new technology works. One trial we're doing is a multi-center trial among multiple other healthcare systems. Every other single trial is directly to the consumer. And that is really weird. 2.5 years ago when I came here, I would have never guessed that. I assumed I would have been doing everything that we normally do. And a lot of that is, and I'll try to focus on this, is the challenges of doing things within healthcare systems while all of you are trying to kind of, you know, it's often building an airplane while it's flying, and there's a lot of challenges to incorporating things that are not easily fit in to it. So I think it's important to recognize that what I'm going to be talking about is stuff that is a lot being done outside of healthcare systems. It doesn't need to be, but it just has proven so far to be easier that way. Now, I use mHealth, and I've learned after giving this talk several times that I've had people ask me, what is mHealth? So I'll just get out of the way because I think there's iHealth, telehealth, eHealth, mHealth, any kind of health. But I'll use it the way the NIH uses it. So any mobile wireless device to improve, it used in healthcare basically, either improving health outcomes, healthcare services, or health research. So I'm going to touch on 4, I think, key areas, and I want to start with this progress in technology and perspective. Now, Clark and all of you in the room actually are well aware of that, but I want to put it in perspective as a clinician, and so I'm going to start with my career put it in perspective. So I did my cardiology training starting in 1995. At that time, the world's fastest supercomputer, ASCI read 1.8 teraflops per second, $55 million to develop, occupied a room about the size of this here, used about 800, the electricity equivalent of about 800 homes. 10 years later, you could get the exact same computer power in your PlayStation 3 that many of you had in your home. And in 2016, it's predicted we'll have our first teraflop cell phone, smartphone, with that kind of same computing power. So that's in the lifetime of my career, which I hope is maybe at best half done, that's a pretty dramatic change in our computational power. How about in cognitive computing? Well, in 1997, 2 years into my cardiology training, IBM's Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov. That was a huge thing, right? It was an amazing breakthrough in cognitive computing, pretty one-dimensional. Right now, if any of you wanted to, you could download one of a number of chess-playing apps just as powerful on your phone. And IBM has gone, obviously, well beyond the one-dimensional cognitive computing capability of chess and has shown in Jeopardy that it could beat the world's champions in jeopardy in multiple dimensions. At IBM Watson, Alex Trebek is standing in front of one of the consoles. Again, it's room size. We don't know the cost, but obviously tens of millions of dollars to put that together. This was in 2012. There's no recent picture of Watson, but it's described by IBM as the size of 3 pizza boxes stacked up. It's 24 times faster than it was then, and 2,400% improved in performance. And one of IBM's next big things, besides Chef Watson and many other stuff, that they want to show what the capability of Watson is they're going to have Watson pass the medical boards. And it's going to kill it. I mean, it's going to do so much better in the medical boards than any of us, certainly than I would have, but most others with medical school, just by its ability to synthesize all this information. So you're going to have, essentially in the palm of your hand, by any cloud-based system, the capability to, the same amount of knowledge that I went to medical school for, and everybody goes to medical school, at least in terms of just textbook knowledge. Now, there's obviously a whole lot more to that, but that's a whole lot of knowledge. Now, let me go to the connectivity that I jumped to already. So I remember at the start of my fellowship, I actually knew one person who had a mobile phone, and this is what it looked like. Now, this is a picture of Gary Gecko from Wall Street, and so he was the richest and stuff. So this is in late 1980s, so the brick cell phone was there. But really, less than 1 out of every 50 people in the United States in the early 90s had a mobile phone, and that's obviously taken off, where now we have more than one mobile phone per person in the United States. And the cost has obviously gone down dramatically too. This is one of the first phones that I actually had in a car, and I really hope I didn't pay that much for it, but that's the ad I found when you did that. So we have this connectivity, and this is a picture that I think really tells the story of how this has just become so prevalent. This happens to be a picture from St. Peter's Basilica when Pope Benedict was named Pope in 2005. Here's a picture at the exact same location, exact same event, exact same time of day, and you can see what the difference is and how prevalent phones have become in that short period of time, just in their decrease in cost, how available they were, how the networks were available. And so this has also dramatically changed in the time since I started training. We spend more times now in America and most westernized country looking at our smartphone and tablet screens than we spend looking at any other screens. And it's really depressing if you add up all the numbers of how much time we actually spend, the average American spends looking at screen time, so don't do that. But if you look at then worldwide, smartphone growth, so PCs are kind of flattening out, tablets and smartphones are taking off, and they're just going to continue to grow. In the United States, already 91% of all individuals have mobile phones, 2/3 those have smartphones. And worldwide, that's just going to continue to expand. This is one prediction from Ericsson that goes out to 2019 with 9.2 billion mobile subscriptions and greater than 80% of those with mobile broadband. So it's going to, essentially we have this ubiquitous connectivity almost anywhere in the world, and I'll get to that global part of it a little bit later in my talk. But that's a remarkable change in connectivity and computational power since the time I started my training in 1995. But now I want you to think about how I would assume most of our cardiologists, primary care doctors, practice outpatient medicine. And that's what most of my discussion is going to be, is not the amazing stuff we do in inpatient setting, but really the outpatient care that we provide and really what patients want. How do we keep them healthy? How do we keep them out of the hospital? If you assume that the great technology we have in the hospital, well, that's when we've kind of failed and the patient has required to be hospitalized. So let me put it in a historical perspective. So you come into my clinic, always get a blood pressure. Well, the blood pressure cuff was developed in about 1880. This is a picture from 1904. It was really popularized in the United States. There's less mercury involved, but if you look at that picture from 1904, it's really not very different than what we do today. I'll probably get an EKG, or at least I'll look at your most recent EKG. The EKG was developed in 1911. Now, at that time, you had to put both legs and one arm in a saltwater bath, so we've gotten a lot better than that. But really, in about 1944, they perfected the 12-lead EKG that's standard now, and the leads have gotten a little bit better, and they're adhere. They used to be suction cups, but really that technology is pretty much 70 years old. And then the quintessential, and I'll talk more about this too, aspect of you coming to see me is I'll listen to your lungs and heart and use a stethoscope, which was developed in 1816. The normals, that was a single tube. The stethoscope that we think of as the usual stethoscope today is from 1850s. Here it was initially kind of poo-pooed, oh, this is stethoscope, dangerous technology, let's not incorporate this, but over time became standard, and this is William Osler in 1900s with his stethoscope. Now, one thing that is different in how I see, at least over time, is the lack of a house call. Right? So in the 1930s, which is the most recent time I could find any good numbers for house calls, about 40% of all patient contacts for care with physicians was in their home. Now it's well less than 1%. And it has obviously had a dramatic downhill slide over that from the 1930s and on. And so we have become this very brick and mortar, and I like what Clark said, is our clinics, are really designed around my convenience and the convenience of our staff and not around what's for patients. And I think what mobile technology and this chronic care will be able to do is return us to caring for patients in their real world, in their homes, and less in our brick and mortar settings. Now, I will point out this picture of the house call, which I just love, comes from a Camel cigarette ad. So at least in that aspect, we've gotten much better. The whole ad is talking about how you trust your doctor, therefore, and doctors smoke Camels, so you too should smoke Camels. So that part is good. So how can mHealth make a difference in chronic care and in home? And I'm just going to give you some examples because really this is mHealth has a lot of potential energy. And I'll talk a little bit about the challenges and the lack of data in this and reasons why that may be. But I just want to kind of highlight some of the gaps, just a very few number of the gaps, and then potentials where mHealth can make a difference and where that fits in. This is just a slide or a figure from a recent review article on mobile health technology, and I put it in here just mainly to show that you'd be amazed at how many freaking young, smart, Stanford and MIT and everything else dropouts who have, are funded with billions of dollars of money are developing these technologies that are just really remarkable sensors. And the number of people working on this is really incredible. And the technologies are incredible. And they're geared towards every organ system in the body. Some of them are very early. Some of them will likely prove to be totally worthless, but some of them are really good, and there's a lot of work. So I think of the sensors as commodities. It isn't really about the sensors. It's really about developing the systems to take advantage of that information coming into you from outside from those individuals, because the sensors will keep getting smaller and better and doing more and more. And I'll just give one example. Many of you may be wearing a Fitbit. I'm not sure why. It's never been shown to actually increase your steps, but we all like wearing the Fitbit, and it'll be a very popular Christmas gift to everybody. And not just Fitbit. I'm not picking on just that. Any activity monitor. It makes us feel good, and it's a lot cheaper than putting an exercise bike that ends up being a clothes hanger in your basement somewhere in your garage. So a lot of wrist-worn activity monitors. If they're really fancy, they monitor your pulse, and that's becoming more and more common. Almost all the activity monitors measure sleep, but a couple of the better ones actually measure sleep stages. So it'll be able to tell you deep sleep, light sleep, and whatever. Oh, the picture I have on the side is just the Samsung SIM band, which isn't available yet commercially. It was Samsung announced it about a year and a half ago, and it's still working, but you can see all the sensors in the wristband part of it, as opposed to those who have Apple Watch, where the sensor is in the watch itself, and the SIM band has that too. Now, I'm going to list of all of the things that a wristband sensors that are being developed and are being studied can measure. So besides activity pulse and sleep stages, there are several groups working on devices that measure blood pressure continuously, right? So every beat of your heart, your blood pressure and how it changes on wrist-based devices. your cardiac output, and stroke volume, as well as an EKG just by reaching over and completing a circuit by touching your watch, and you can get a single lead EKG whenever somebody feels lightheaded, palpitations, or anything else. It can also measure stress. So there are a couple of actually devices available now. Now, how accurately it does it and how meaningful it is, we still have to find out. But right now, mental health is one of the world's biggest contributors to morbidity. Not mortality, but morbidity. Thank you. See, not enough coffee on the way up. And it contributes to morbidity, but we have no objective way of measuring it. So all of you feel some stress in your life, and if you tell somebody else, they'll probably sit back and go, yeah, right, I'm stressed too. So we all, and doctors are no different. There is no magical way to determine what's really important stress and what isn't. There are also, so these wristbands will offer the capability of measuring stress levels at every time in your life. So when you're in a meeting, when you're late to pick up your children at school or any setting, and more importantly, hopefully recognize what you can do to decrease that stress. For asthma and COPD, they measure respiratory rate, oxygen saturation, and carbon dioxide levels. And then if you measure skin temperature, hydration status, and glucose, the question mark being they don't measure glucose well enough yet to actually dose insulin, but they measure glucose well enough to be able to tell you how your glucose levels change when you eat a stack of pancakes compared to a bowl of oatmeal at breakfast in the morning. So it can help people with their dietary solution. So there is no one wristband device that does all of this, but there are multiple wristband devices that each do parts of this. And there's nothing that's going to prevent that from eventually all being combined. And when you think about what the capabilities of this can bring you, because if you think about, okay, right now, if I wanted to measure those, even half of those, this is the only setting I could do that in. In the intensive care unit, I could put a catheter in your radial artery. I could put another catheter through your jugular vein into your heart and measure your cardiac output and stroke volume. We can measure continuous temperature probe, but we're going to have that ability to do that with just a wrist-based device in the very near future. And how that can change care and how we can do things, the opportunities are really endless, though we're not there yet. And that's the key is how do we get to that point and show where we can have a benefit to the patients. And the technology is not limited to just wristband devices. As I mentioned, the sensors are just commodities. They're going to keep getting better, smaller, cheaper. This is a device that was just recently announced out of Finland that it contains a lot of valuable information in just a ring. So it measures heart rate, respiratory rate, your body temperature, and movement. And then they have an algorithm where they can measure sleep quality. So again, your stages of sleep, how much REM sleep, light sleep, or deep sleep, just by wearing this ring. And they compared that to polysomnography, a formal sleep lab, and showed it correlated extremely well. So the capability to measure things in patients' homes, in their real-world settings, in settings that we have no idea. I have no idea what your blood pressure should be when you are stuck in traffic, late to pick up your children at school, and maybe it should be 180 over 110, maybe it should be 120 over 80. No one knows. We've never had the ability to do that, and these technologies will allow us to do that. Now, obviously, I'm a big believer that these are going to make a big difference in healthcare, and others who predict this will reinforce that. Wearable usage grows 60%. Here's a 5-fold increase in healthcare-related wearables through 2019. Here's how many billions of dollars between, almost 3 times increase up to 2019. And then the last, an increase in wearable device traffic. That's 18-fold increase between 2014 and 2019. And so a lot of people are very enthusiastic about where this can make a difference, but it's fair to say that others are more cautious about it. This is Gartner's hype cycle from a year ago. I can't wait until the 2015 hype cycle comes out, but here's mobile health, right in the trough of disillusionment. So really kind of suggesting, it was really overhyped and it's not going to go anywhere, or it's going to really be a minimal plus. Ezekiel Emanuel agrees with that. He's become kind of the radical spokesman for anything medical, in saying, I think you can forget about wearables for the masses. Maybe with a little more authority, the Permanente Medical Group CEO saying, video and big data are the future of wearables, not so much. So there's really it's not clear. You've got businesses thinking everything is going to be the Internet of Things, it's all going to be the wearables, it's all going to be this data, and then people who are maybe a little bit closer to healthcare saying, not so fast. So I think that just shows the challenges that we have within our healthcare systems too, is trying to figure out, is this really beneficial and is it going to really make a difference? So let me just focus on some ways where it can and look at the gaps. And I think it was Clark who said, okay, is our clinic times designed better for our staff and physicians or for our patients? So here's a very nice recent survey, a Nielsen survey, looking at care availability to 5,000 diverse Americans across the country. So only less than a third had access to a nurse to answer any questions. 3% had doctor's house calls and everything in between. But, so essentially, if you wanted medical advice 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, about 14% of the US population, based on this survey, had that kind of capability. And then it was even less if they really had they wanted to interact with their primary care doctor. So it could, only 11% had the ability to submit a question online. And I know that this is really growing. And I should point out this survey was published about a month ago, and the survey was accomplished about 4 months ago. And so even though this may not represent your healthcare system, and many of you may have the my Scripps equivalent on there for that, but at least for the majority of the nation, they're still missing that capability to ask a question to their primary care doctors. And again, it gets less and less, and only 2% have the ability to have any virtual medicine technology visits, and that I'll talk a little bit about is growing. So those gaps lead to important not meeting the patient's needs. And I love this quote from Ryan from Google, who said, and didn't provide any evidence, but if I quote him, I figure it must be accurate. But he really said, they know at 4:30 in the morning across the United States, said in every time zone, at 4:30 in the morning, there are 1 million people who are Googling information on ear infections. 1 million people across the country at every time zone and every time Googling ear infections at 4:30 in the morning. That's a remarkable unmet need. And if you can think of some of the technology, so this is just one, a Selfscope. So for these parents, if they had that capability, they're sitting up at their computer anyway. If you thought, golly, all we have to do is get this little clip-on onto their smartphone. They're able to take an image of their child's ear. They can either send it in to somebody who's on standby and looking and to see if, you should come in or not. Or even with automated decision support. This is a photograph that they'd be able to analyze and look for signs of infection in an automated way. So I think that really to take advantage of mHealth and to meet the needs of the patients, these are the kind of focus we have to, as Clark said too, understand what it is that the patients need and then create solutions that address those. And this would be one very small and singular example of a huge unmet need for children. Another unmet need, but unrecognized, is with one of the quintessential sign of a healthcare provider is the stethoscope around the neck, right? So I've seen many, and maybe some of your healthcare systems have as an ad, my favorite thing about a stethoscope is I get to get this close to a patient. And it's a beautiful symbolism, and I think doctors believe it. And there is good things about it, but the honest answer is, at least in studies, and no single doctor will, I think, agree that they're part of this study, but we have no idea how to listen to the heart, at least, with the stethoscope, right? Even though we do it, it's the quintessential part of an exam. It's the most important part. We all have stethoscope. But here's a study of 860 providers in the gamut, from trainees all the way to faculty cardiologists, and looking at their ability to identify heart murmurs. So a systolic murmur, which can be benign or dangerous, we're really good about detecting those, but we're really horrible at noticing if they're not there or not if they're present, and worse than a coin flip. Worst is in diastolic murmurs, where there's almost essentially no normal diastolic murmur. Our ability to recognize that is about a coin flip. Right? It's the equivalent of a coin flip. So instead, next time your doctor is listening to your heart or one of your cardiologists, just ask them to flip a coin instead and decide of whether you have a heart murmur that requires an echo or not. Yet it's still the common part of our practice. And when I was in medical school, in the late 1980s, I was taught to measure the liver size by tapping on my finger down and seeing what the size of the liver is, right? Hardly anybody does that anymore, and it's hard to do, but medical schools are still teaching that, despite the fact now there are 3 different pocket ultrasounds or handheld ultrasounds. This is the GE's version of the V-scan. It's been around since 2007 and used very little and sparingly. There's only 3 medical schools in the country right now that even expose medical students to handheld ultrasound and how to do ultrasounds. There have been some more recent competitors. This is Sonocyte that has a brand new handheld system that's really designed to be more than just an ultrasound, but to allow you to populate the electronic health record. And then Philips just announced their Lumify, which is actually, it's just a probe that you can just connect to any Android tablet or phone and gives you very high quality devices too. So, you know, in a world where we really want to do what's best for patients, instead of kind of falling back on pretending that we know what we're listening to when we listen to someone's heart with the stethoscope, or that we're tapping on somebody's belly to see how big their liver is or their spleen is, instead using an ultrasound and teaching our medical students and doctors to use these ultrasounds is going to be one of the ways to use medical technology to really decrease the cost of care and prevent a lot of unnecessary formally or ordered ultrasound studies. But that requires a lot of work to really show that we can do this and to get there. And then the one chronic condition I want to mention, and it seems always unsexy compared to a lot of the stuff that's being done in the hospital, is hypertension. But it's important because 1 in 3 Americans has high blood pressure. We spend nearly $100 billion on its management every year. It's actually the single most common reason to see a primary care doctor in the United States today is for hypertension. And I think for any of you who are physicians in the room, or if you ask your physicians, I think most people would agree it takes pretty much an 8th grade education to manage hypertension because it's very algorithmic. It's very, we know how to treat it, we know what to follow, and I'll show a clinical trial example of that. Despite all the money, despite the fact it's the single most common reason for an outpatient visit, half of the individuals in the US who have high blood pressure don't have their blood pressure adequately controlled, and worldwide that's 20%. And even though that seems, well, that's a nuisance and a chronic condition, when you look at it globally, hypertension, high blood pressure, becomes the single greatest contributor to morbidity and mortality worldwide than any other risk factor, than cigarette smoking, than diabetes, than malnutrition, than overnutrition, any other risk factor. Hypertension is it. And that is a pure failure of systems of care because we've known how to measure it for well over 100 years. We have therapies that are less than pennies a day. And yet it is a huge contributor to early deaths and early morbidity in worldwide and in the United States. This is the example of the study. This was a study done in England. It was one of 2 similar studies that had the same results, where they compared typical primary care management of hypertension to self-management, self-monitoring and self-management of hypertension. So they took hypertensive patients, gave them a home monitor, as well as instructions saying, okay, if your blood pressure does this, do this. If your blood pressure is this, do this. And so gave them, the patients, their own algorithm. After a year, their blood pressure in the self-management group was 10 points lower than in the group that was managed by the primary care doctors. I think evidence that if we develop the right system of care that empowers patients to do more, and we're able to kind of sit back and keep an eye on them, that we can make a big difference. And Clark mentioned, he was mentioning on glucose and the capabilities, blood pressure, we have an array of wireless devices. The wireless cuffs, this is an example of iHealth and Withings. There are several others, but they're wireless. They don't even have the tubes to blow up the cuff. They do it automatically and then send the information right to your smartphone, which then you can send to your care providers if there was a capability of receiving it, which in most healthcare systems there's not. But there are newer technologies that aren't dependent on blood pressure cuffs that allows you to measure it anywhere at any time. This is one device called DYNASense that you can actually hold it in your mouth, And it measures your blood pressure, a single lead EKG, your respiratory rate, your temperature, your oxygen saturation level, as well as your respiratory rate and your depth of respiration. And then it has a little device that sits next to your electric toothbrush. You plug it back in, it gets disinfected and charged, and you're ready to do it again the next day or that evening. And then it tracks your collection of vital signs. And then there's the Scan-A-Do Scout, which is both of these are in large-scale studies. Neither one is commercially available yet, but the Scout, you just hold it against your forehead for about 30 seconds. It, too, will measure your blood pressure, your pulse rate, gives you a single-lead EKG, your temperature, and your oxygen level in your blood. It takes about 20 seconds holding it against your forehead. And it automatically sends that to your phone, and then for most people, just sits there on their phone because there is no kind of final place to connect that information to, and I'll show a little bit about that lack of connectivity in a little bit. But what all these technologies allow is these developments of different systems of care that it really can be designed around what that specific individual needs, whether it's just wellness type interventions, if the individual has diabetes, has hypertension, just wants home diagnostics, whether, with recurrent ear infections or urinary tract infections or palpitations or anything, there's a suite of tools. And then asthma or COPD, there's also a suite of sensors and tools. And all of that can be fed into a smartphone device. And then there are multiple patient and provider platform systems that allow the patient to understand that. Now, do we know exactly how that'll work? We don't. There's a lot of patients who want all their information. There are a lot of patients who want hardly any of their information, and that is a big struggle to figure out exactly how to do that. But the capability is there for us to at least start asking those questions and exploring how do we get the information to the patients in a way that doesn't overwhelm them, doesn't depress them. And there are studies that show that just giving them a lot of their information in a good number of patients can lead to that and actually helps them. And then on the other side, on the provider platform, you can get a scorecard-like system. This is just one of several examples that really, in this very simplified red, yellow, green, you can follow up and target the right people, whether they're not monitoring themselves like they're scheduled to monitor themselves, or if they monitor themselves and they have a number that's way out of whack. Somebody in the healthcare team can look after them. At the same time, you have a very robust predictive analytic platform that's becoming more individualized to really understand not when Joe Smith is declining compared to a population, but when Joe Smith is declining relative to himself, when Joe Smith was feeling well. And we have that capability to be able to start identifying that with the right sensors and the right technology to achieve that. And I mentioned the global aspects of mobile health because when you don't have healthcare systems, it becomes a really easy place to try very novel healthcare technologies. This is a slide that I've borrowed euphemistically from John Sculley, who was at Pepsi, then Apple, and now is at MD Live, a virtual healthcare provider, but a nice picture on of somebody using an iPad on a water buffalo. There's been a huge capability, so where there are no landlines, where there's no electricity or a lack of electricity, and many other things that we're used to, but mobile phones are taking off and connectivity is taking off. So it really offers this opportunity to do things dramatically differently. This is a picture from a National Geographic article on Ebola. And it was just designed to show a village healer, who's the person in the foreground there with his face painted. There's a 3-year-old girl on the mat who they were afraid had Ebola, and the village healer was going to do what village healers do to treat the Ebola. And that's what the whole picture was about. And this one point where I wish I had a pointer, but if you can see, there are 3 people in the background, the 2 teenage boys and a teenage girl. They're all looking at a smartphone at the same time as this village healer is going. So you think of this dichotomy of what you're seeing. So this is like primitive healthcare, and yet 10 feet away, these people can connect to the Mayo Clinic, can connect to any kind of information, can connect to any kind of multiple medical devices. So you have this remarkable capability to just dramatically upend health and healthcare in these settings by using the mobile technology. And there are a lot of studies being developed to really show that I think in many ways may leapfrog what's being done in the US because the need is there and the capability is there. And I'll give give one example, this is a study that we recently completed at an Ebola treatment center in the middle of Sierra Leone, in McKinney, Sierra Leone, really in the middle of nowhere. Had generators, the British Army built the hospital. It's basically a tent hospital. And you can see on the patients, they're wearing a little adhesive strip on their chest. That strip continuously transmitted a single lead EKG, relative changes in blood pressure, respiratory rate, posture, activity, temperature, and oxygen saturation continuously. From outside the red zone, where you can see where everybody is wearing the protective gear for the one individual on the left-hand side being admitted, the two patients standing at the gateway, this is where they're fed, so their food comes across the table here, and behind, where they are is the red zone, where healthcare workers only go in wearing protective gear. On the side where we're taking the picture is the green zone, where you can get away with that. But this is an example, the data we were getting of this continuous transmission of vital signs. Now, this is an Ebola treatment center, but only 2 patients out of the 40 who were admitted during the 3-week period actually had Ebola. So actually, any patient admitted there got continuous monitoring of continuous vital signs, and allowed for the development of predictive analytics that would be able to recognize and warn healthcare workers when that individual is decompensating relative to the condition they were in when they showed up. We don't have this in Scripps or in any hospital I'm familiar of in the United States anywhere. But we were doing it in McKinney, Sierra Leone with essentially our own homemade internet and Wi-Fi network in the middle of nowhere there. And when we got the grant to be able to do this, the question that came back from our Scripps leadership, and this will sound worse than it really means, is, well, why aren't we doing this within Scripps? And the answer, I think I said nicer at the time than this, is, well, Scripps is not giving us $700,000 to do this, and the USAID is giving us the money to be able to do that. And the USAID recognize this as being a large unmet need in the care of patients in there, because they have no brick and mortar facilities. And in the US system, it's not recognized as a big unmet need, at least not recognized as a big unmet need enough to actually do something about it. So all of you are aware, and Clark mentioned it, of this changing landscape in healthcare. Apps are overwhelming, and patients become very focused on it, but 165,000 different healthcare-related apps, 100% increase over the last 2 years. And I think things like this are really what muddies the waters when you look at mobile health and what the capabilities are, because there's so much garbage out there mixed with some really good things, and physicians don't have the time or the capability, and no one else is doing it to really, how do you separate out what's helpful and what isn't? Of those 165,000 apps, 36 of them account for 50% of all the downloads. So at least people recognize what good ones are. If anybody's wondering what the most popularly downloaded app is, it's the Walgreens app, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the future. And I mentioned that the problem with a lot of these sensor technologies, the wearables and the app, is that they don't connect to your provider. So only 2% of these 165,000 different apps, some of them specific to healthcare systems, connected with healthcare systems. So 98%, there's no connection, so it's just for the patient. For many, that's good, but for most, then that's cutting us out. And you can see that the number of total downloads, not the number of apps, but the total number of downloads has now reached 3 billion in 2015. It's been increasing by about a third every year since they're looking at it in 2013. And the majority of the people don't actually end up using them. So this is just a small survey of a little bit less than 400 people. About a quarter of the people use the app only once, never use it again. Of those who use it more than once, 3/4 of them stop it by the 10th use, so essentially don't use it for more than a week. So the vast majority don't work, but on a more positive note, that means about a quarter of the people actually download it and use it at least beyond a week. Now, that for chronic condition management, that's totally worthless, but maybe for an acute discharge or follow-up after emergency room, that may be helpful enough. And that's something we need to figure out better as to how do we maintain that kind of engagement and keep patients using things that we want them to use. We have to be really aware. I mentioned there's a lot of garbage we don't know. There's actually dangerous things I call digital snake oil out there, and we have no good regulatory oversight yet of that. These are apps that the FTC has actually taken off the market, has forced and fined these developers. Ultimate Eyes, designed to tell you to tell people to improve their vision. Jungle Rangers was an app that was advertised to people with children who have ADHD, saying if they play this game, it'll help their ADHD. These are two of my favorite. These are two apps for treating acne using the light on your smartphone. That surprisingly didn't work, but both of these companies got a lot of money before they were shut down by the FTC. And then it isn't just apps, they're actually devices. The Gobi, which is actually, the last time I presented this, somebody looked it up, and you can still buy one, but has had multiple articles written about it. It's just a big ripoff. What it proclaims to do, as well as this Arrow, which was developed at a university in Winnipeg but was withdrawn before it was ever available, they both say that they will measure how many calories you ate passively, right? So you can eat whatever you want, and it would be monitoring in your blood how the protein levels, carbohydrate levels, and fat levels changed in your blood over time. And that's what they're kind of selling you, as well as being an activity monitor, though with no evidence it actually works. This was a nice one that was, the developers actually ended up in jail. It was just a scam. They said you could just scan your skin and see what vitamin deficiencies you had and what you needed. And then here's another, one of my favorite technologies, where this was advertised on the Apple App Store for entertainment purposes only, to measure your blood pressure. So the idea would be you'd put your finger over the light and hold it against your chest, and it would give you a blood pressure reading. And there's this great testimonial on the app site that said, you know, my blood pressure always used to be in the 170s in the doctor's office. I was on 4 medications. My blood pressure here was great. I stopped all my medications. It was still great. Thank God for you and the developers of this. And that's a real danger of you know, really having no oversight in what's being developed and what's being available to people. Now, with all of the apps and the technology and stuff, and Clark mentioned how Scripps has just developed, I saw it was in the news today, their first retail clinic. And this is a PricewaterhouseCoopers report from last year talking about upending U.S. healthcare industry and who will be the Amazon.com of healthcare. Well, frankly, it may be Amazon.com, because they're exploring healthcare and getting into the healthcare field, as are many others. Everybody knows everything that these technology giants are all involved in. A lot of it is technology. Some of them maybe even dipped their toe into healthcare before and then pretty much got it bit off, and so decided, okay, we don't want to be healthcare providers. But Google Life Science is doing remarkable stuff around technology and genomics and others. IBM Watson obviously doing a lot. Samsung with Symbian, and Apple just met with the FDA. But the people who, you know, I said, Clark mentioned if you start a retail clinic, you'll be ahead of the curve. Well, you might be ahead of the curve for healthcare systems, but you're a decade behind the curve in people like CVS, who have minute clinics, over 1,000 locations in 31 states. They've already seen over 25 million patients. CVS has over 5 million customers coming in their stores every day worldwide, and they have this convenience for the customers. Walgreens, too, even though smaller, they have 400 healthcare clinics across the U.S. I mentioned they have the most used healthcare app. What also is very clever about Walgreens is they have this Balanced Rewards program. They already have over 800,000 individuals downloading mobile health data, blood pressure, glucose readings, sleep levels, weight, activity measures to Walgreens, and doing it purely for loyalty points. It's not going to be very hard for them to flip a switch and say, hey, we want to collect that $40 a month of chronic condition management from home. You're sending us your data already. Why don't you just keep sending it, and we'll, you know, formalize that relationship and do more for healthcare. They're the primary provider of flu vaccines in the country. They have 7 million customers every single day coming into a Walgreens store, and that's even before they combine with Rite Aid, and so they're going to be a huge force to do that with. And it said that 75% of the U.S. population lives within 5 miles of a Walgreens. And both of these clinics have also combined with virtual health providers. Not only do they offer the convenience of being seen on your corner, where you can look on your app and say, I want to see a nurse practitioner, it's going to cost me this much at this time. And Walgreens was hoping to have the capability to do in-house labs. They had an exclusive contract with Theranos. Everybody knows that is not looking too good right now, but maybe eventually they will have the capability of doing labs in-house and really can provide remarkable capabilities. And these two are soon to be in competition with Walmart, which has said they want to be one of the country's dominant healthcare providers in the industry. And you can imagine their customer base and their capability to be able to provide primary care and chronic condition management and acute diagnostics conveniently and easily pretty much any time of day. And then for those who don't need to go to a physical location, there's multiple choices in terms of virtual care. MD Live is one, but these are 17 others that are being developed and available somewhere in the country of virtual health care, that you can get your care by just, they each have different pay models, they each have different maybe focuses of what they do. Some are just nurses, others are specialists who you pay by the minute, but most of them are really just a set fee, let's say $30 to $40, and you tell us your complaint and we'll help you out. Others, like Lemonade, are very focused on specific things. They'll do urinary tract infections, sinusitis, birth controls, and male pattern balding, as if that's a problem. And they'll deal with that, and only in Pennsylvania and California, but they say $15 to do any one of those. So you do have any one of those, you just log into Lemonade, you talk to a physician and get a prescription. And for those who think about these things, they see this virtual care being the fastest growing aspect, more so than retail clinics and other settings over the next several years. Now, there's a lot we have to learn about virtual care. It's not the same as seeing an individual, and this is one very small study. But just the fact that this is the only study I can show shows you we have a lot to learn. So this was a study out of, I think, UPenn, and it compared office visits versus so 2,800 office visits versus just 99 e-visits for people who had complaints of urinary tract infections. And what they found is that if you had an e-visit, almost no one got a urinary culture, whereas 50% of people got a culture if you had a face-to-face visit. That makes sense. But what is maybe not surprising but a little concerning is that if you had an e-visit, almost every single person got an antibiotic prescription, whereas if you got an in-person visit, half did. Now, to me, my guess is that's the psychology kind of wanting to do something. Now, it turned out in this very small study, each approach was equally successful, at least in terms of a need for a follow-up visit. But really, it would suggest that, gee, I can't see you, I can't touch you, I can't do anything that is the art of medicine, so I want to make sure I do something. And the only thing I can do is prescribe you an antibiotic, so why don't I give you an antibiotic? So we have to be very cautious as we explore these new ways of delivering healthcare as to what is, making sure that we're doing it the right way and not, we want to be consumer focused, and patients are often happier when we give them antibiotics, but that's not necessarily a good thing. Now, in the last couple slides, just what are the barriers to adoption? Well, here's, I think, the biggest barrier as a researcher. These are 3 meta-analyses of all the studies around mobile health. Every single one of them conclude that we don't have enough evidence to change care. Right? We are full of pilot studies in mobile health that show remarkable results. In fact, somebody has studied that. 92% of all studies published on mobile health outcomes suggest a positive outcome. Yet when you really look at it rigorously, saying, okay, for you folks who are in the position to make decisions, do I want to incorporate this technology? Do I want to change care by using this technology? You can feel pretty comfortable saying, well, there isn't really the evidence there to do it, even though I'd also say that almost everybody in this room has the ability to help generate that evidence to help change that. And I think the biggest challenge, and the reason we don't have evidence, because there have been some very big studies, and Clark touched on this too, and I'm going to use my analogy to the productivity paradox from when we were switching from steam engines to electrical power at the turn of the 19th century. So at the time, 95% of all factories used steam engines, even though it was about 2 decades after the electric dynamo was developed. And in the steam engine, because the further you get away from it, you lose power. All factories were designed with power requiring processes all built around the steam engine. So it may not have made sense for the production in terms of you may have to do step A and then bring it up 1 floor to do step B and then bring it back down 2 floors to do step C, but it was all based on using the power and where you lost the powers. When the steam engines started being incorporated, it took 40 years to see any meaningful increase in productivity. And the reason is that factories took this brand new technology that could have been game-changing and instead put the electric dynamo in the exact same place the steam engine was. So they didn't change their processes of manufacturing, or for us would be processes of care, to take advantage of the technology. They did the same thing they always did, they just brought the new technology in. And I think that's what we're doing a lot in healthcare. And it really wasn't, at least in terms of electricity, until Henry Ford and his assembly lines. Sadly, tobacco manufacturers were some of the very first to recognize if you take electric power, it doesn't degrade as you get further away from it, that you can make manufacturing processes built around the actual steps in the process. You can develop systems of manufacturing that are logical, and you're not hampered by keeping everything close to the steam engine. And by doing that, that's how we started seeing finally this increase in manufacturing productivity by taking advantage of the technology. And I think it's the same with the mobile technology, that really to see what impact they can have on care, we have to get away from saying, okay, this is the way we manage whatever it is right now. So I used to be an interventional cardiologist, so I use the example, okay, every post-interventional patient, this is how we take care of them now. Now we'll do it with a wearable sensor, and we'll see what happens. Well, nothing will happen, nothing meaningful really in the big picture. You really have to sit back and say, let's completely redesign care. And a lot of the challenge to that is the financial incentives around it, but that's the only way to really look at it and to take full advantage and shows where these can make a difference. So in conclusion, or in summary, I think we are well into this technology revolution of unprecedented computational power and connectivity, but I think at least, especially in terms of outpatient management of our patients, our consumers, our individuals who really want us to be more health-focused and less disease-focused, we're just beginning, and we're at the very, very earliest stages of leveraging that technology into healthcare. There is a wide availability and variety of wearable sensors for health and wellness. It's rapidly increasing, although there's very limited clinical uptake, and I think that's driven a lot by there's just not that connectivity there. And as Clark mentioned too, that you're just going to overwhelm physicians right now if you don't have the systems in place to make the information meaningful to them to actually use it, and until then they'll be resistant to it. There's a lot of consumer-facing, non-traditional providers who may be in a stronger position than us legacy healthcare systems to really transform healthcare, to take advantage of that chronic condition management. And then finally, mHealth technologies can enable, but they alone are not going to drive this complete re-engineering of the healthcare landscape. It really requires everybody in this room and the people you work with to develop the new systems of care that take advantage of these technologies. Thank you, everybody, for your attention.